So we can just go ahead and kind of decide how you want to go ahead and do this and talk about whatever you want.
Outline Paul's history, like he was born in Line E, a suburb of Torino, in 1885, April the 7th, April 15th rather. And he went to school for 4 years only, and that was only during the off season when the farm they didn't have no farm work to go. They didn't go year round. They only went part time. And let's see. Yeah, helped on a farm. At the age of 11, he was already out of school. He was big for his age, so he got a job in Torino. And he worked for an English company that made the city gas. And his job, him and his buddy, works 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, shoveling coal. They made coke and gas for the city lights. And in order to get a Sunday off, every other Sunday he said they'd work 24 hours. That way that the following Sunday he'd get off. So, let's see. Every other weekend he'd go home. He'd get a day off because the other guy worked 24 hours. And then when he was 16, that was the working age in Italy at that time and in Europe, legal age. His brother John sent for him. His brother John was working in an iron mine in Alsace-Lorraine on the French side, and he started to work there. And he worked in a mine. And he learned to speak French and some German because half the country belonged to Germany at that time. And he worked there until he was about 20, and he got in a fight with one of the miners down there, a German miner. And he said that when it was all over, he had that guy bleeding and laying down unconscious, so he picked up his bucket and went up the air shaft before quitting time, picked up his clothes and headed back for Italy in a hurry so he wouldn't get in trouble, I guess. And he went back to Italy, and if he would have stood in Italy, he was going on to his 21st birthday, then you have to go in a service. So he decided he wanted to leave Italy, and he wanted to come to the United States. And so when he went back home, it was in the fall of the year at that time, and he helped his dad. He always talked about his last days at home when he helped his dad bring in the wheat and the farm thing, and how many quintals of wheat they got per towel of land, you know, which was, he thought was a good harvest.
Which was basically bushels per acre in essence.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Only they went by quintals over there. Most of the Europeans used quintals. And so we decided he wanted to come to America. That was his. Let's see, let me read something. He wanted to go to America, but everybody in his hometown of Line E at that time were all going to Argentina. There was nobody going for years to America. So his dad knew one fella there that had a son that had come to the United States, and he had come here 10 years prior. And so he got this address from that guy, because you had to have an address when you hit United States. Where's that, where we'd come in that island?
Yeah.
Ellis Island.
Ellis Island.
Yeah. If you didn't have an address, they'd send you back. So he had this one address, this one guy that he never met, and this guy had been in this country for 10 years. So on a ship, his shipmate, the guy they had the room together, got to talking, and that other guy only had one address too, and his address was in Pennsylvania, so they exchanged their address so they'd have two apiece. So just in case, you know, one didn't work. So sure enough, when my dad got in got in Ellis Island, they couldn't find this little mining camp on a map no more. It was gone. And so they detained him a couple days, and finally he had to give them that other address. So they found that in Pennsylvania, and they put him on a train for Pennsylvania. So the next day he arrives there with these people with this guy, you know, that he had met. And he said those people treated him real good and fed him for a couple days. And they found out he'd worked in the iron mine, so they told him that they were hiring in Nagooni, Michigan. In Michigan. And so they put him on a train. He went to Nagooni, Michigan. And as soon as he got there, he got a job in Nagooni, Michigan. And he went out and bought his own clothes because everybody there was speaking French. And he could speak French. He's a lot of French people. And so he had this job in a coal mine, in an iron mine. And he stood with these French people. And he lived upstairs, and it was a clapboard house and had no insulation upstairs or no inside wall, and there was big cracks. And he said it'd get so cold up there in the winter that his nose would freeze to the blankets in the morning. But he had enough blankets on him that he would never get cold. But he had to break his nose loose every morning from the blankets.
Wow.
Because that wind would just blow right through that thing. He said it snowed so much there that before the snow started, you had to go up about 5 steps to get in the house. And by the end of winter, you was coming down 5 to get in the house. And he said on the north side, you could walk, even though it was a 2-story house, it would drift so much that you could walk straight on the roof from the snow.
Is that northern Michigan?
Yeah, that's way up north on a peninsula.
Okay.
And
Up
then,
by Sault Ste. Marie.
yeah, it's way up.
Do you know how that's spelled? Do you have it spelled in case any of us would want to look on a map to find it?
It's N-E-G-U-N-E-E, something like that, Nagooni.
Nagooni, okay.
Yeah. And there's an Air Force base close to there right now. It's not too far from the Canadian border. And then he told me about how that mine he worked in. And this mine he worked in was already an old mine, but a friend of mine that I worked at Dow with worked in that same mine. Granite City later bought that mine, and he worked on that same mine. And these iron mines, they sink a main shaft. It goes down way over 1,000 feet, and then every 100 foot there's a level. And they start on the top, and they make holes down 100 foot, and they have wheelbarrows. They worked it all by hand, and they just take all this ore and put it in them holes, and the track would be underneath. See, they work it all the way down, and then they'd start the next level. They just keep, and the mountain would keep caving in on the top. And naturally, when they were working, they would timber. And he said those timbers would stick up in the air. You had to try to knock them down. If you couldn't knock them down, well, they were solid enough to stay up there. But they just kept working straight down, and there was a real high top in places where the timbers would be hanging down. Well, he worked there, and he got in this country in 1906. I don't know exactly what month, but that's when he got here. And then from after when he was working there, going back a little bit, before he left Italy, his brother John quit also, and he came back to Italy, and he wanted to come to America with my dad, but he didn't have his papers ready. And my dad didn't want to wait because he's afraid, he said, I'll go if you want to come, you come later. So he said one day he was walking down the street in Nagooni, and his brother come walking down. So,
well, that's a coincidence.
yeah.
That was really a coincidence.
So then they were together for a little bit, but they couldn't get along. He couldn't get along with his brother. See where the hell.
Now, is that one John that wound up in Christopher?
No, John was the oldest brother.
Oh, okay.
Joe was in Christopher.
His dad was married twice, wasn't he?
No.
I thought they said that his dad was married twice. He had
When my dad came to this country, Bob and Joe, our Uncle Joe, had just died recently, was only 5 years old. He was just going on 6 years old. So he often told me that he remembers going with his father to take my dad to the station. And he was just a little kid then. Let's see. Anyway, find out what the hell
Well, you were talking about where the brother came over,
yeah, the brother.
but they couldn't get along.
Right.
Then he went west.
Right. Then he left there. And let's see, where the hell am I at? Past this page, I guess.
Well, wait a second.
Well, being that they didn't get along, he decided to leave. So he rode the freight trains. He went west. And he took the northern route and went into Idaho. That's the same route that my brother Joe took years later, because every time he got a card from Joe, he said, well, what's he doing there? He says, I've been through there and there was nothing there. Through Helena, Montana that way. And he went into Idaho and he started working there a while. And he worked in several mines there. And then he took a stagecoach. He always talked about the stagecoach ride from there into Nevada, because there was no lines running north and south at that time, railroad lines. So he rode the stage with a bunch of, he said there was 2 women in the stage with him. And he said they were screaming all the way because these mountain roads, those horses go wide open. They run about 20 miles, he said, and then they pull over and they put new horses on them and they take off again. He said, you made just as good time as you did with the train, you know. And he used to enjoy watching cowboy pictures when he'd see those stagecoaches, because he rode one and he always talked about it. When we got to Nevada, he worked in a small mining camp. He got there and that's where he first met Mr. Castelloni. Castelloni had a little money, and those miners used to, what they call, when they get enough money to have a stake, they'd go to these companies, and these companies would furnish the powder and the tools, and you had to furnish the work. And if you hit any pay dirt, what they call pay dirt, in the gold mines there, well then they would split it. And so these guys that had a little money would hire a miner or two, and he hired my father, and they worked this entry. They give you an entry to work, you know. And they worked it was rock mining, and they worked it till his money ran out. And then if you didn't hit nothing, that was it. You quit, you know, you lose your, it was just like gamble, in other words. And he talked about sometimes the guy would go so far and run out of money, and then somebody else would go in there, and no time at all they would hit pay dirt and make some money. But they didn't make anything. So they opened up a little tavern in this little town, him and old man Castelloni.
Grandpa did?
Yeah, in this little town they had a tavern.
Gambling and everything.
No, not this tavern here was just a regular tavern. And what happened was one day the cowboys came into town from after they made their cattle run. So there was about 20 cowboys. And they came right in the tavern with the horses. They were all drunk, and they shot up the place. So at that point there, he said, it's time to leave, and he left. And
He went to Ely.
yeah, he went from there, he went to Ely. He worked in the
That's a
mines
nice
there.
town.
Yeah, and then there was a point there when he was in Nevada, and I don't know if it was before he put the tavern up in Italy, in Ely, that he got sick from his lungs, either lead or
Lead poisoning.
lead poisoning, and doctor said he couldn't work no more. So an Italian farmer took him in, and he slept outside in a hammock for a whole year. He never, and that fellow fed him, and all he could do was little chores around. He'd milk the cow or do little chores
Now,
around.
where was this at? In Nevada?
In Nevada. For a whole year he couldn't work, and he had to sleep outside.
He had special medication for that them days too. I forget. Remember he was telling us they gave him some for the pumpi, and he called lead pumpi.
Yeah, pume poisoning. That's lead poisoning. And then later on, I think that was before he opened up the tavern in Ely. Him and another fellow opened up a tavern. They had a real good business. Like Bob said, they had gambling. They used to buy whiskey, raw alcohol, and make their own whiskey down the basement. They pour it in a tub, and half whiskey and half water, cut it down to about 190 degrees, 90 proof, and they'd brown it and everything, and they used that for bar whiskey. And they were doing real good there, but they couldn't get along. So my dad finally said, either you buy me out or I buy you out, and just one of us will run the tavern.
Yeah, my dad, he actually knew the odds of a lot of these games, you know. The Pharaoh ran in the gambling house. I guess my dad handled quite a bit of the gambling because he knew all the odds.
And it was at that time, in 1908, that he got his citizen papers right there in Ely, Nevada.
Now, how many years was he in the United States before he got his citizen's papers?
Well, he came to the United States in 1906.
Okay, so 2 years there. Okay.
Yeah, a little over 2 years. And
well, I want to tell you, my dad visited me when I first moved to California. And he wanted to go to Ely, Nevada, but I didn't know that until later when my mother told me. But he told me all about where he'd been through, all the mining camps. He was in Utah, Idaho,
yeah.
and I went the same route when I went back east. And I went through Ely, Nevada, and I asked the old Italians with a couple homes if they remembered my dad, and they didn't remember him. But my dad was telling me then about when he worked in the copper mine and running this joint in between, you know. And this copper mine caught on fire. And there was, most of the men got out, but there were some that were trapped. But the owners of the mine wanted to save the mine, even though they could hear the guys pounding on the rails, they sealed the mine up. And my dad said that same night they went and got these two owners and unsealed the mine and threw those two owners into the mine and left them to die with the other men. So they're probably still there now. That was one of the stories my dad told me. But then, when I went through Ely, I took pictures and postcards. And I showed them to my dad when I came to Benal. He knew all the damn buildings. He says, I stayed at the North Hotel, and he pointed. In fact, I went into the North Hotel because I knew my dad stayed there one time, but I couldn't find the records, you know. And then he said, this is where so-and-so had a place, this is where my place was, and he could recognize from the postcards, all these different buildings, and this was many years later. And then I stopped in Utah at a mining camp where he worked. I can't think of the name of the town anymore, but the coal mines were still working. Some of them coal mines.
Well, anyhow,
Now you let Aldo take over now.
So after he sold the tavern, he moved. He started to bounce from mine to mine. Like he said, he went to Utah. He told me about being in
Colorado too.
Salt Lake City, and swimming in that lake there, Salt Lake, and at the Tabernacle, it was already completed. He went through that and worked in different. He was bouncing from mine to mine. It was easy to get a job if he was a miner them days. Then he went into Colorado, and he got a job there working for a power company. Him and another fella had to unload one car, a 50-ton car. At that time, they only had these 50-ton cars. They were flat-bottom cars. Every day they had to unload one car of coal between them. You know, 25 tons apiece, and 7 days a week. And he's telling me his buddy got sick, so he had to do it all by himself because that car had to get unloaded. He did it for about a week. Then he was wearing out, and he said he was about 3/4 done with the car, and he wanted to hire three Indians that came by to finish it, and they wanted more money, he said, than what he was getting for the whole car. So he ended up unloading the whole thing. So he worked at that job, and while he was working in Colorado, this story was that he was walking down the street and he heard a guy singing in a tavern. And it was Mr. Franconi's brother from Banal that he had never seen, but their homes were close enough in Italy. He was just a little boy and he could hear him singing. This Mr. Franconi was older than him.
About 10 years.
About 10 years older than him. He could hear him singing. He could hear him singing, you know. And so he recognized the voice right away and he went in there and sure it was him. But this Franconi already had lead poisoning so bad that he was dying. And so he had one son and his wife was dead already. So this mining company gave him the option, if he wanted to go back to Italy, they would pay his way. So he decided to go back to Italy, but he left the kid in an orphanage there. And my dad used to pick him up every Sunday and take him to dinner. And the boy, I think he came to Banal one time, years ago. But, okay, so in the meantime, he had bummed his way on freights and trains, passenger trains, back and forth, back east to Illinois and back west. He told me 3 times he went back and forth, east and west, you know. And that he, at one point he told me he was riding in between the cars on a passenger train.
I did that too.
And he was in a desert somewhere. And they spotted him on there and they stopped the train in no man's land and they left him off. And he didn't know where he was. It was real hot and it was in the afternoon. He walked all that night, all that afternoon, all that night, and he was thirsty in hell. Finally, that next morning, he had a ranch house and he went over there and he got something to eat and drink. And they told him how to get back to civilization. But he thought he was a goner that time, he said. And he told me about riding the rods, you know, where they used to lay down underneath the train cars. These are passenger cars. They got rods that cross underneath, and they spread eagle on there, you know, and they lay on there and they
lay boards on there.
They lay on the rods. And
talk about dangerous.
yeah.
Kidding.
Okay, that's not going to get you.
See.
I think you worked in Price. You worked in Price, Utah. I remember going there, where he worked in the mines. And then he also worked in gold mines in Colorado at one time.
California.
Colorado.
He never did go to California. He did while he was in Nevada. He did buy some land in California.
Yeah, he owns some lots in California.
Right where Los Angeles is now.
Yes, he had 3 lots in California.
Yeah.
Los Angeles area.
But when he left, he said he didn't know what to do with them, so he sold them.
He made a good profit too, he said.
Yeah, but I wish he'd have hold on to them. They had one apiece now, right in downtown Los Angeles. Anyhow, the last time he worked, he came back in 1914. He was working in southern Illinois. And that's where he met my Uncle Jim Leone. And that's how he seen a picture of my mother. And
sent for her.
well, he started writing. He didn't send for her. He started writing for her. And, you know, they started writing back and forth a little bit. And so my mother was ready to leave Italy because she couldn't marry the guy she wanted over there. So her and her sister came across during the World War II. And they came across and came to southern Illinois, stood with my uncle, and my dad started going with my mother. And at that time, they went, according to what my mother said, they went together a while, and then they couldn't get along, so they broke up. But then they went back together, and they finally got married in 1915, I guess, wasn't it, Josie? 1915. And,
Yeah, because I was born in 1960.
yeah, and they got married, and during the wedding, which lasted 3 days, she said, the wedding lasted 3 days, and at one point there, he stepped out on a porch, and the guy took a shot at him. They never did figure out
Well, he wanted more, and
Well, yeah, he was a boyfriend that worked in between there for a while. And so anyhow, they got married. And in this little town, they got married in Benton, Illinois. But he was working in a mine in Weaver, Illinois, where Bob and Josie was born. And he had a tavern there that was like a park, and benches and that all around the park. And the tavern in the summertime, they could open the sides up. They had these open doors, and these people, it was the only tavern that was open in the county. And the county next to it was all dry. So all these people would come there on Sunday and bring their buckets and pitchers and that, and have their own lunch. And they'd sit there and buy beer and drink. And he said, I was telling Bob on the way up there, he told me that by himself, as just one bartender, but he had a couple of girls helping with the beer, that he got rid of 35 barrels of beer, not these little ones, these were barrels.
32-gallon barrels.
Yeah, 35 in one afternoon. And
He must have served a lot of people, though.
Yeah, he said he would turn on the spigots and never turn them off. You know, they'd have minor buckets and stuff like that, and they just kept pushing them forward, and the girls would pick them up and hand them to the guys.
Now, he was married to Noni then?
Yeah, he was married. He had the tavern until beer went out.
Prohibition.
Yeah, Prohibition come in, and he still kept it open. And they warned him and warned him. Finally, they picked him up one night and put him in jail for about overnight or 2 days or something like that. My mother was real worried. So that was the last time. Then they shut it down for good. And what he did, he gave a lot of that whiskey away, but he did take about 4 or 5 cases home. He gave almost everything away, you know. And right after that, his Uncle Jim already had come to Bunnell. So he decided they were going to come to Bunnell, and they moved to Bunnell in a boxcar with the cow and all. And my Uncle Jim rode in a boxcar and milked the cow, and they come down on the streetcar, but my uncle came down with the cow and all the furniture in a boxcar. And he come to Bunnell in 1918. And that's as far as I got on my trip. From there on, let Bob do some of the talking then.
Well,
one thing I've got at Paul's, and the only thing I kept as a souvenir, is his registration for the World War I.
He was?
Yeah.
He registered and was called, but the war was about ready to end when he got.
I got the card.
Called
He
because
registered for World War I.
Because you and Bob were, already born then, and he was in his 30s, so they didn't call him till late. But if it had lasted much longer, he'd have gone. He already called him up.
So he would have gone to service from here, from the United States.
Yeah, from Bunnell.
So he was a citizen.
but to fall back, when Dad was doing all this mining, he was pretty well expert in explosives. And when he worked in the mines, he was always a driller with explosives. And he was very good at his job as a miner, because he kept the top level without putting big pock marks in. And
Well, in the coal mines, yeah.
yeah, in the coal mines.
And he told me that he worked in 36 mines before he came to Bunnell. 36 different mines in this country. Yeah, and all different types of mines, from copper,
Gold, lead,
zinc, and not zinc, but silver. A lot of those.
He told me he also worked in the salt mine, but Aldo says no. But he told me he worked in the salt mine up in the Michigan area. That's what he told me.
He worked in the iron mine in Michigan, and he worked at different types of mines. Like I say, in Michigan they took everything and it caved in. Now in the rock mines they have 100,000 miles. I mean, they go down thousands of feet too. And every 100 feet they have a layer, what they call a layer,
Entry.
a drift. Well, it's an entry or a drift, and when they work those rock mines, I've been in one, for gold, they just randomly go somewhere. They call them a drift. If some guys have a good nose, they can smell that gold. And what they do, if they hit a vein, the veins always run, the veins are cracking in the rock, and then it fills up with gold. And when they hit one of those, that's what they call pay dirt. Then they have to follow it up until it runs out or to the next level, above it. And what they do, they always mine up. And they put a platform, and they mine up, and they always build a chute coming down. The rock is, they follow it any way it goes. And then they shoot that and they use what they call a paddle. Push that thing down, rock down that chute. And then the little cars down, two of them work together, the guy's on the bottom, he pushes the weight, fills the thing. Then that's all weight and everything, and it's pay dirt, they get a cut on it when you're working on the commission.
But when Grandpa worked here, when he was here in Beneld, until he retired, didn't he work in the coal mine?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure, yeah.
And then he was